The horrific event from last Wednesday in Brisbane would have dominated conversations right across the weekend. If you are like me, every conversation eventually turned towards the sad death of Hannah Clark and her 3 children, murdered by her ex-husband, Rowan Baxter, a man who decided that he was going to take his whole family with him for whatever reason, whatever was going on in his head in the end. Of course, the wider community have been discussing how to stop this happening again and what needs to happen. And, of course, domestic violence has been put right into sharp focus and the fact that we need to do something about it. On Friday, Jess, we spoke to psychotherapist Kayleen Wynn, who we've spoken to before. We spoke to her about the poo jogger.
Yes.
Kayleen's an amazing mind, and she deals with people who are right in this, in domestic violence situation, and particularly violent men. She spoke to us about the fact that there's a narrative inside their head. They feel like the whole world's against them. They feel persecuted and marginalised, and, you know, they can end up thinking that this is the only course of action for them. So there's all sorts of things going on. My contention, as it was with Kayleen's, is the only person that really could have stopped the violence and the horror that happened last Wednesday was Rowan himself.
Absolutely.
The police
I
couldn't
agree.
stop. He was known to police. He'd been arrested and there was AVOs and all those processes in place. And Hannah had even moved out. And this, it seems like,
Moved in with the parents.
Moved in with the parents, and people say, you know, why doesn't the woman just leave? It's like, well, it's very complex, and she did leave, and actually that kind of precipitated the end. Not saying that, you know, she was to blame at all, but she'd taken every action she could. So the only person that really could have stopped it was Rowan.
That. And that family would have felt so much guilt as manipulative, violent people pass the blame onto other people. They would have felt so much guilt that they couldn't do more for their daughter. But there's nothing that anybody could have done except for Rowan. You're exactly right.
And as it turns out, since then, agencies in Queensland have had a massive spike in men reaching out who are afraid of being violent to their partner and family. So immediately it's had a very positive knock-on effect, and that's a good thing. I'm going to read a little bit of an open letter that a guy called Toby Francis sent to the newspaper. And this is really interesting for me, and it's along the same lines of violent men can stop violence. That's where it can start. And if you identify that you've got those urges and that you think you might be doing something, then you've got to reach out to a friend or to an organisation and say, I think I'm going to be violent. There's a whole list of places where you can go, including Beyond Blue, 1-800-RESPECT, Lifeline, 13 11 14. And also I think that we've got to change the language too. To start calling people mongrels or low dogs or monsters or evil, it's not. He's a man and he's got that potential.
Yeah.
So Toby writes here that he moved and he wants to break down the myth of, you know, there's good men and there's bad men. It's like, no, there's men do bad things. And you've got to be able to say, hey, I think I'm on the breach here. So he was talking to a mate of his. He moved in with his girlfriend. He had an argument and the argument escalated. He got really angry and he started smashing things. He smashed a couple of plates and he broke a broom. And his mate identified it straight away and he told me, writes Toby, in no uncertain terms, that what I was doing was violence. That one day it would turn into me pushing Lauren, which would one day turn into me punching Lauren, which would one day turn into me hitting our kids, which could end up in me murdering my partner. I remembered being shocked and resistant to the idea. I would never, ever hit or physically hurt my partner. I said, I'm not that kind of man who would commit domestic violence, let alone murder somebody.
What a great friend to
what
bring
a great
that
friend.
up.
But also that division of, I'm not that kind of person. Well, you're a plate smasher or a, you know, door slammer
a wall puncher
or a wall puncher or whatever. It can escalate, and it may well escalate unless you understand that behaviour is dangerous in itself.
Well, when you're not thinking clearly, you find, and it's not just violence, but all sorts of things.
You
You find yourself
justify it.
doing something and you're going, how, this isn't me.
Yeah.
Why am I doing this?
But
Well,
we've all
sometimes you
done
don't
something-
even have that narrative. This isn't me. They're like, why did you make me do that? That's a, you know, your
Yes.
behaviour made me do that, and that's a justification within the mind.
And we do that a lot. You know, it doesn't necessarily have to be domestic violence. Something goes wrong and all of a sudden you're looking to shift the blame very quickly. If
Yeah.
you hadn't have done that, I wouldn't have been distracted
Yeah.
and I would have been able to do whatever.
And there's no self-reflection to think maybe I was wrong. You just put that in the basket as right. That person made me do that. I'll continue on.
And so just in terms of, our understanding the potential for escalation and that we all have that potential for violence and that there's not mongrels or low dogs or, anything other than a man that didn't stop himself, that's what you've got to acknowledge. So if you are, if you're frightened of your own potential, if you're frightened of your own violence, reach out.
This is Moonman in the Morning, Sydney's 104.9 Triple M.